Hello, fellow wanderers, and welcome back to Retire and Roam. I'm glad you're here. If you're the kind of person who sees retirement as a chance to live smarter, travel deeper, stretch your dollars further, and discover places with real stories behind them, then you're in exactly the right place today. When most people hear the words ghost town, they picture the American West, dusty roads, broken saloons, and forgotten mining camps. But the truth is, the Deep South holds its own haunting collection of lost places, and Alabama may be one of the most surprising states of all. Here, the ruins are quieter, older, and wrapped in pine woods, river fog, and Spanish moss. In today's journey, we're exploring 8 ghost towns in Alabama that shouldn't be there. From former capitals that rose fast and fell hard, to once promising boom towns, to a community now resting beneath the water, and even a town that began as pure illusion. Each stop reveals more than abandoned ground. It reveals how people built, struggled, adapted, and sometimes disappeared when the world around them changed. And that's why this matters. Here at Retire and Roam, we're not just looking at ruins for the sake of history. We're looking for useful insight about change, resilience, opportunity, and the choices that shape where and how we live, especially in retirement. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's head into Alabama's forgotten corners together. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Retire and Roam for more stories, places, and practical inspiration for the road ahead. Paragraph 1. Old Cahawba. We begin at number 1 with Old Cahawba, and few places in Alabama tell a more dramatic story about ambition, opportunity, and hard reality. Imagine standing at the very center of political power, only to be slowly overtaken by water, war, and time. That was the fate of Alabama's first permanent state capital, established in 1819 at the meeting of the Alabama and Cahawba rivers. At first, Cahawba looked like a brilliant choice. It rose out of the frontier with remarkable speed and confidence. In just a couple of years, it had a functioning state house, a state bank, hotels, stores, and a population that actually outpaced Montgomery at the time. For early Alabama, this was not some sleepy backwoods settlement. It was a place built to lead. But like many towns that seem perfectly positioned on paper, Cahawba had one fatal weakness. Its riverfront setting gave it beauty, access, and commercial promise, but it also left the town exposed to repeated flooding and serious health problems. The location that helped build it was the same location that would undermine it. By 1826, lawmakers had seen enough, and the capital was moved to Tuscaloosa. Still, Cahawba refused to disappear quietly. After losing its political status, it reinvented itself as a prosperous cotton trading center. On the eve of the Civil War, more than 3,000 people lived there, and for a time it seemed the town had found a second life. But once again, larger forces closed in. The war devastated the region. Railroad tracks were torn up. An overcrowded prison known as Castle Morgan was created there for captured Union soldiers. Then came the flood of 1865, and that was the blow the town never truly recovered from. By 1900, former residents were dismantling homes and carrying away bricks board by board, as if the town itself were being erased by hand. Today, Old Cahawba survives as an archaeological park, and that may be the most fitting final chapter of all. The streets are gone, the buildings are mostly gone, but the outline of a once important place still lingers beneath the trees. Walk there long enough under the old oaks, and it is easy to understand why so many visitors say the place feels charged with memory. Local stories still speak of a glowing orb drifting near the cemetery and the ruins, often said to be the spirit of a lost soldier who never found his way home. And that brings us to the deeper lesson. Cahawba asks a question that matters far beyond Alabama history. When life keeps rising against us, do we keep rebuilding in the same flood zone? Or do we find the wisdom to move our dreams somewhere stronger? Sometimes the bravest decision is not to hold on. Sometimes it is to let go, relocate, and begin again. Paragraph 2. Bellefonte. From a capital lost to nature, we move now to a town undone by a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. Our second stop is Bellefonte, tucked into the hills of Jackson County, and its story is one of those powerful reminders that progress rarely waits for anyone. Bellefonte was incorporated in 1821 and grew into a thriving county seat. By the 1840s, it had the kind of professional and civic life that gave a frontier town real standing. Lawyers, doctors, politicians, travelers, and local merchants all passed through. There was an inn, a courthouse, and a sense that Bellefonte had secured its future. For a rural southern town in that period, it represented stability, respectability, and upward momentum. Then, the next era arrived on iron rails. When plans were made to bring a railroad through the region, the people of Bellefonte were faced with a choice. They could accept the disruption, the noise, the outside influence, and the speed of change that railroads always brought with them, or they could protect the quieter life they already knew. They chose to say no. They did not want the disturbance. They did not want the pace. They did not want the future arriving quite so loudly. So the depot was built several miles away, and with that one decision, the center of gravity shifted. Trade moved first, then opportunity followed. Businesses went where the tracks went, and people followed the businesses. That is how decline often happens in America, not always with one dramatic collapse, but with a slow draining away of energy, traffic, investment, and purpose. The Civil War delivered the final blow when Union forces burned the town, and by the 1920s, the last resident had left. What remains today is haunting in its simplicity. There is a historic cemetery with headstones reaching back to 1826, and there is one lonely brick chimney rising among the trees where the old inn once stood. That chimney says almost everything. A community that once seemed secure can become a memory if it resists the very forces reshaping the world around it. And that is why Bellefonte still speaks so clearly to us now. How often do we reject a new technology, a new idea, a new financial reality, or even a new season of life because it feels inconvenient, unfamiliar, or noisy? Are we building walls to keep change out, or are we laying tracks that allow new possibilities to come in? Change does not ask for permission. We either learn how to move with it, or we risk watching life pass by from the platform. Paragraph 3. Blakeley. From Bellefonte, we move south into the coastal wetlands of southwest Alabama and arrive at Blakeley. Chartered in 1814, Blakeley was not just another small town on the map. It was a real Gulf Coast city, ambitious enough to challenge Mobile and bold enough to believe it could win. With its deep natural harbor, Blakeley grew fast to an estimated 4,000 residents. It had hotels, a bank, its own newspaper, and a busy shipyard. For a time, it looked like a place destined to dominate the region. It had commerce, confidence, and all the signs of a city built for a long future. But Blakeley stood in the swampy lowlands of the Mobile-Tensaw Delta, and that landscape carried dangers people did not yet understand. In the 1820s, yellow fever and malaria swept through the town. The losses were so severe that some residents had to be buried in mass graves. At the time, people blamed the swamp's bad air. They did not know that mosquitoes were the true enemy. Even before the Civil War, much of Blakeley had already been abandoned. Then came its final and bloodiest chapter. On April 9, 1865, about 16,000 Union troops attacked the Confederate earthworks here in one of the last major battles of the war. The tragic irony is that the battle took place the very same afternoon Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. While peace had begun in one place, men were still dying in another. Today, Blakeley lives on as historic Blakeley State Park. Visitors can walk past the old cemetery, the earthen fortifications, and the famous hanging tree and hiding tree, both wrapped in Civil War legend. It is a powerful place, quiet on the surface, but heavy with memory. Blakeley leaves us with an important reminder. The force that brought this city down was not a rival port or a failed dream. It was something tiny, unseen, and relentless. And that asks something of us too. What small habits, hidden stresses, or quiet burdens are draining our health and peace a little at a time? Sometimes the greatest threats in life are the ones we barely notice until the damage is done. Paragraph 4. St. Stephen's. From the swamps of Blakeley, we move to higher ground, and to one of the oldest layers of Alabama history, St. Stephen's. Long before Alabama became a state, this high limestone bluff above the Tombigbee River held a Spanish fort, and later a U.S. trading post. It was a place of strategy, movement, and early importance. In 1817, St. Stephen's became the first capital of the Alabama Territory. It quickly grew into a lively center of commerce with more than 500 homes, hotels, a theater, and the state's first chartered bank. Important laws and political decisions were shaped here. For a brief moment, St. Stephen's stood at the center of the region's future. But that prosperity did not last. When the capital moved to Cahawba in 1819, St. Stephen's lost the political role that gave it power. Then transportation changed. River traffic improved in ways that let boats travel farther upstream, and the railroad later bypassed the town altogether. Slowly, the streets emptied, and the original settlement slipped back into the woods. There is also an old legend attached to this place. A visiting minister named Lorenzo Dow once said St. Stephen's would be cursed, that it would become a resting place for bats and owls, and that no stone would remain upon another. Whether you believe that story or not, it feels fitting when you walk through Old St. Stephen's Historical Park and see the scattered bricks and silent ruins. St. Stephen's gives us a lesson in humility. This was once a capital, a place of influence, status, and momentum. Yet it faded like so many centers of power. Titles change, careers end, and wealth shifts with time. But the legacy we leave in the lives of others lasts far longer than any official position ever will. Paragraph 5. Arcola. At number 5, we arrive at one of the most unusual origin stories on this list. Arcola, the heart of the famous vine and olive colony. If the other ghost towns were shaped by politics, trade, or war, Arcola began with something more romantic, a dream carried across the ocean. In 1817, the United States Congress granted a large stretch of Alabama wilderness to a group of French exiles. These were loyal officers, soldiers, and merchants tied to the fallen Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. They came to the Deep South hoping to build a new life through vineyards and olive groves, bringing European ambition into a land that was wild, humid, and unfamiliar. Their leader was General Lefebvre Desnouettes, one of Napoleon's favorite cavalry commanders. He even kept a log cabin shrine to Napoleon, complete with a bronze bust and military trophies. It is one of those details that makes Arcola feel almost unbelievable, as if part of Europe had briefly landed in rural Alabama. But there was one problem they could not overcome: the land itself. These refined officers and aristocrats were not prepared for the demands of the Alabama frontier. They tried to grow grapes and olives, but the Deep South had other plans. The summer heat was too harsh, the winter frosts too damaging, and the entire agricultural vision began to collapse. By the 1850s, most of the French settlers had moved on, and American planters had turned Arcola into a cotton community. Today, very little of the original colony remains. What you find instead are quiet fields, river bends, and the historic half-house plantation, a place also tied to the painful history of slavery. Arcola may look peaceful now, but it holds the memory of a dream that never truly fit the place where it was planted. That is what makes Arcola so meaningful. Those exiles tried to force Alabama soil to produce a Mediterranean future, and they failed because they could not adapt to the reality around them. In our own lives, especially in retirement, are we still trying to grow old expectations in new conditions? Or are we learning to adapt to the season we are actually living in? Paragraph 6. Battelle. From the failed agricultural dream of Arcola, we now shift to a very different kind of ambition, one built not on vineyards and olive groves, but on iron, industry, and the promise of progress. Hidden along the slopes of Lookout Mountain in DeKalb County, Battelle is a ghost town that rose with enormous confidence and then seemed to vanish straight back into the forest. In the early 1900s, northern investors led by Colonel John Gordon Battelle looked at this rugged land and imagined an industrial powerhouse. Through the Lookout Mountain Iron Company, they poured serious money into the project and built fast. A massive blast furnace went up, along with coke ovens, a hotel, a school, and hundreds of homes. Some even had running spring water supplied from a wooden tank. For a brief moment, Battelle looked like it might become one of the South's next great steel centers. But the land held a hard truth. Once mining began, it became clear that the iron ore here was simply not rich enough or plentiful enough to compete with the booming operations around Birmingham. The dream started collapsing almost as quickly as it had been built. By 1905, the furnace was already on standby, and the town's future was slipping away. Then came one of the strangest twists in any Alabama ghost town story. During World War I, the giant iron furnace was dismantled, sold to the British government, and shipped all the way to Calcutta, India, to be rebuilt there. In a very real sense, Battelle was taken apart and carried off piece by piece. Today, the forest has reclaimed nearly everything. Brick ruins hide beneath the trees, and local legend still speaks of the ghostly cries of a worker who died after falling into molten iron. Battelle leaves us with a lesson that still feels practical today. Colonel Battelle and his investors built an entire community before fully proving the foundation beneath it. And that raises an important question for all of us. How often do we commit our time, money, or energy to a plan before testing whether it truly has the strength to last? Before we build our next chapter, it pays to make sure the ground under it is solid. Paragraph 7. Riverton. From a town that was taken apart, we move to one that was swallowed whole. At number 7, we come to Riverton, a ghost town that should not be there because technically, it is no longer there at all, not above ground. Riverton is one of Alabama's submerged, lost places, resting beneath the waters of Pickwick Lake. Located in the far northwestern corner of the state along the Tennessee River, Riverton, once known as Point Smith and Chickasaw, was an important river port with real commercial promise. In the 1890s, it was significant enough that the federal government sent engineer George W. Goethals there to design the Riverton Lock. He created a 26-foot single-lift lock, the tallest in the United States at the time, and that success helped pave the way for his later role in building the Panama Canal. Riverton also attracted the big dreams of businessman Alfred Parrish, who bought up land hoping to create an industrial rival city. He even built a local passenger train known as the Doodlebug. But the recession of 1891 crushed those plans before they could fully take hold. Even so, Riverton still had life left in it. What finally ended the town was not economic failure alone, but modern progress on a much larger scale. In 1938, the Tennessee Valley Authority completed Pickwick Landing Dam to bring the region flood control and electric power. To make that happen, the gates were closed, the water rose, and Riverton was deliberately drowned. The town gave up its place on the map so that surrounding communities could gain security, electricity, and a different kind of future. Today, Riverton lies beneath Pickwick Lake. In winter, when the water drops low enough, you can sometimes glimpse the top of an old Indian mound, or sections of the former lock walls breaking the surface. The one part of the town still on dry land is its cemetery, which carries the chilling local tale of 15-year-old Maggie Williams, said by legend to have been buried alive in 1909. Riverton is a powerful reminder that sometimes a future worth having requires letting go of something that once defined us. A town disappeared so a region could move forward. In our own lives, that can mean releasing an old job, an old address, or even an old identity so something stronger can take its place. Paragraph 8. Spectre. And now we arrive at number 8, the most unusual stop on our journey. After real capitals, real ports, and real communities lost to war, disease, and water, we end with a ghost town that should not exist for the simplest reason of all. It was never a real town to begin with. Welcome to the town of Spectre. Set on Jackson Lake Island near Millbrook, Spectre feels like something halfway between a dream and a movie set, which, of course, it is. In 2002, director Tim Burton needed a magical, isolated location for his film Big Fish, and this island became the perfect stage. An entire town was built here, complete with broad-porched houses, a white chapel at the end of the road, and the now famous line where visitors toss their shoes, just like the shoeless townspeople in the film. Once filming ended, the production was supposed to remove everything, but the property owners chose to let it remain. Over the years, nature and time have reshaped it. Fire destroyed the commercial district, and floods and tornadoes damaged several structures. Even so, the remaining facades still stand with a strange beauty, faded, fragile, and full of atmosphere. Today, Spectre draws visitors from all over the world. People come to walk its quiet lanes, take in the eerie charm, and add their own shoes to the line. And unlike the other towns on this list, Spectre has some very cheerful current residents, a friendly group of free-roaming goats and sheep that give the place an oddly playful spirit. It is part film memory, part roadside curiosity, and part southern daydream. What makes Spectre memorable is not just that it survived, but that people wanted it to survive. It was created as a temporary illusion, yet it left enough joy behind that no one wanted to let it disappear completely. And that may be its deepest lesson. The things we create, stories, beauty, laughter, wonder, can last far beyond the moment they were made. Leave a little magic behind, and people may carry it much longer than you expect. Conclusion. From the flooded streets of Old Cahawba to the vanished promise of Bellefonte, to the dismantled iron heart of Battelle and the dreamlike quiet of Spectre, Alabama's ghost towns are far more than abandoned places. They are reminders of how quickly power can shift, how fragile success can be, and how deeply the forces of nature, technology, health, and human choice can reshape an entire community. What makes these places so compelling is not only what disappeared, but what remains. A chimney in the woods, a cemetery on high ground, a ruined furnace, a chapel from a movie set. Each one tells us that while buildings fall, roads fade, and towns slip off the map, the stories never really leave. The lessons stay with us. And for those of us thinking about retirement, reinvention, or simply how to live more thoughtfully, these places offer something valuable. Be adaptable when the world changes. Do not ignore the future when it comes calling. Know when to hold on, and know when to move on. And wherever life takes you next, leave behind something meaningful. If you enjoyed this journey through Alabama's forgotten corners, be sure to hit like and subscribe to Retire and Roam for more stories that combine travel, history, and practical inspiration for the road ahead. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these ghost towns would you most want to explore? And is there a hidden gem or ghost town near where you live? Until next time, keep learning, keep wandering, and never stop roaming. See you down the road.